Davis steps under center. Gibson and McClendon behind him. Davis with motion by Richard. Will give the ball to McClendon. He leaps. Oh, he doesn't get in. He fumbled the football. Carolina holds. The game is over. And Carolina has won the game.
Finley to throw. Over the middle, intercepted. Wolford again. Wolford the other way at the 30, the 40. Wolford to midfield. Miles Wolford with the pick. The heels on the doorstep of an enormous victory.
Left side of the line. Hood standing to Williams' right. Williams gonna throw. One-on-one. Davis has it. Touchdown. Carolina wins. Carolina is the Coastal Division champion. Bernard fields it at the 26. Heading to the far side. Gio at the 35. Gio, he's at the 50. No, he's not. Yes, he is. Gio is going to take it for a touchdown. Are you kidding me? Connor Barth for the possible win. Snap, spot, kick away, high enough, long enough. It's good! It's good! Carolina has won the game on a 42-yard field goal by freshman Connor Barth. Good gosh, dirty.
This is the Heel Tough Blog Podcast. Hey guys, and welcome to another edition of the Heel Tough Blog Podcast. We are in the off season, but it is time to finally do a recruiting roundup, sort of get you guys up to date on everything that has been going on the Tar Heel football recruiting trail. And for the first time in a while, Zack Hubbard is alongside of me. First of all, buddy, how you been, man? It's been a while since you've been on here. We've been really focused on some of the off-season storylines for the Tar Heels, a lot of spring ball, but finally we get back into some of this recruiting stuff with the dead period getting ready to be lifted here at the start of June.
Yeah, glad to be back. Obviously, it's been a little bit of a quiet time as we've waited for everything to start back up here. But, moving forward into the month of June, we should see what should be a fair amount of activity here on the recruiting front.
Yeah, exactly. With the recruiting dead period being lifted, a lot of official visits are getting ready to take place, and the Tar Heels are one of those teams that are going to see a lot of action here early and often in the month of June. It'll start with an unofficial visit, but one that is going to be big, which is five-star offensive tackle Zack Rice on June 1st is going to be the first guy that'll be on campus. Again, it's unofficial, so it won't be quite, what they do with some of the other guys when they'll go around for their official visits, but it's still going to be one of the first guided tours that they're going to be giving to a recruit in a while. So that one's definitely huge. And then you're talking about, that first weekend. You've got five-star cornerback Jaden Lucas, who will be there on June 4th. Jake Pope, the four-star safety from the state of Georgia, will be there that weekend as well, June 4th through 6th. And Sebastian Cheeks, the four-star outside linebacker that they offered out of the state of Illinois, will also be on campus. And there are a bunch of targets that are going to be on campus throughout, including guys like Andre Green, the four-star wide receiver out of the state of Virginia. You've got Dalen Everett, of course, who plays for IMG Academy, but formerly of the state of Virginia as well, who's going to be on campus, and a couple other big in-state names that will also be on campus throughout the month. So, when you look at things opening back up and the Tar Heels getting a lot of these official visits out of the gate, I think, one of the things that I took away from it the most out of anything was that you're seeing a lot of big names that are making it a priority to get to Chapel Hill. And boy, that's a much different feel than what you had under Larry Fedora.
I think so, absolutely. And I think if you look through a good majority of the prospects that you mentioned, a lot of them are from out of state. So that's not even for mentioning, probably a good portion of the in-state guys that would be able to get on campus. Maybe they haven't announced a date, but that will just be able to swing through during the month of June, if not once, then, perhaps twice or a few times. So definitely building sort of that greater recruiting momentum, which I think you'll see in a lot of places along the country in June. But like you mentioned, ton of guys that they have coming in for official visits in the month of June, the majority of these guys from out of state. And we're seeing a little bit of a resurgence of guys that might be outside of the typical recruiting footprint that we've discussed for Mack Brown's coaching staff. Generally, we've discussed North Carolina, of course, definitely Virginia, specifically the Tidewater area, and a little bit into South Carolina and into Tennessee. But you're seeing, a few more guys come out of Georgia. You're seeing guys come out of Florida that are coming up and having that interest and, wanting to see what Carolina has to offer. And I think that's just a continued expression of North Carolina becoming this national brand. Someone that's able to, have interest with kids, not only in your North Carolinas or Virginias, but in Florida, in Georgia, potentially in Texas, in California, even having a guy coming in all the way from Nebraska to take a visual visit here. So, really just a good sign for what Mack Brown and his Tar Heel staff are building there in Chapel Hill.
Yeah, I think, you pointed out Caden Helms, the 3-star tight end from the state of Nebraska. I touched really quickly there on the outside linebacker, Sebastian Cheeks, the 4-star from Illinois. These were two guys that the Tar Heels just recently offered and almost immediately became contenders for in terms of landing official visits. Now, it is tough to sort of determine how good of an opportunity the Tar Heels have to land either one of these guys, but the fact that the Tar Heels are on the official visit schedule, I think kind of shows you just, how big this recruiting footprint has sort of become for the Tar Heels. And I think, as you mentioned, you're seeing them, not only go into, the states of Georgia and Florida, which are areas that, Carolina has been to before. Those were areas that Larry Fedora and his staff really did a good job of recruiting. So they do have some history there. But, yeah, you're starting to see them go into the middle of the country. And if they can start to get into some of those states like Texas, like California, even on the West Coast, which will be tough, but they're starting to show that they've got that national footprint, and people are starting to recognize that Mack Brown and the staff that he's got in place are doing special things here. Of course, I think they'll be again, they'll do their homework really on the guys that are close around here to the Carolinas, of course, into Virginia, an area that they've recruited heavily for years, and then I think Georgia is going to become one of those ones that's going to always be in the rotation. But I do feel like they are going to be willing to extend outside of that, and recruits outside of that footprint are going to be willing to listen, where in the past you just really didn't have the opportunity. I mean, you could get the rare one or two guys. I feel like now, especially I think, another guy that shows it, and Carolina didn't land him, and we'll talk a little bit more about him in this position group going forward later on in the show. But Braden Locke was a guy out of the state of Texas who, even as a 3-star, he was a guy that will probably end up, either a high-end 3-star or borderline or a low-end 4-star. And he's a guy in the state of Texas that, did a lot of winning down there. He's one of the more talented guys, and a guy that a lot of people think can end up becoming a really good quarterback at the college level. Carolina was in the running for him, and it was with him only taking, a couple of visits to campus. I know he was there for the spring game. I'm not sure if he had even been there before then. And Carolina was right in the hunt for him. So I think it continues to show that. I sent you the list over, when we were getting ready, when we were laying out this podcast. And, there's, I think the big question is there's so many different prospects here that are, big name prospects, or ones that Carolina could definitely use. There are some positions in need here that Carolina needs to address in this class. So, when you look at these visits, which of these 3 visits would you label the most important from this group?
I think in terms of the 3 visits that I would label the most important, I would more likely than not just have to go with who's the highest ranked on the board just in terms of composite rankings. And that would be 5-star cornerback Jaden Lucas that you mentioned at the beginning, 5-star cornerback Dalen Everett, and then 5-star offensive tackle Zack Rice. I mean, there are, as you mentioned, there are more specific positional needs to meet, but I think really with all of these guys, there is never enough talent that you can have on the roster. You could always have more talent. I think that all three of these guys sort of speak to that, and it's really just about taking that next step in terms of going from a divisional contender to a conference contender to a national contender. To start out just with the corners, like you mentioned, I mean, you look at even in the first year of his college career, the success that they had with Tony Grimes, you have that sort of to sell on the recruiting trail. You have you can sell the development of a Dre Bly, as we've seen success in that cornerback room. And, you look around the league, you see that college football offenses are getting more pass-oriented. They're getting more explosive. And that puts a premium value on those cornerback positions and on elite athletes at the cornerback position. Now, moving on really to who I'd have as most important, that's got to be Zack Rice, in my opinion. And it could be one visit, it could be the June 1st unofficial visit, and it could be followed by an official visit later in that month of June. But I think you look at the Tar Heel roster, you look at how they've recruited over the past few years, they've recruited elite talent at really every position on the roster. They've been recruiting to rival some of the big boys that we see within the college football landscape. But I think that one position that we've mentioned before, probably the one position that needs the most work in terms of talent infusion would be that offensive line room. Obviously, we like the guys that they have, but in terms of getting those elite guys, we've sort of seen one or two guys in that upper echelon, that 5-star, high 4-star range that they've added to the different position groups. Offensive line is really the last one that we've been waiting on. And, having a guy like that, having a guy with such an elite athletic pedigree, a guy that would come in and, potentially compete for playing time immediately in the offensive line rotation, it's hard to find a visit that's more important just because of the skill of the player as well as the positional need.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely got to be up there. I think you're right. I think that's one of the positions that we've really looked at hard when it comes to the needs in this class, mainly because, I mean, you look at the fact that you are more than likely going to lose Jordan Tucker. You don't really know because, of course, with the COVID year from this past year, guys will be making decisions after their careers are over, or after their careers would normally be over, I should say, as to whether or not they want to use that extra year. So he'll be listed as a senior on the roster this year. It's not like they have to make their decision before the start of this year, as far as we know, unless that's something that's put in place over the next couple of months. But he probably will have the option to come back. But you would think, with what we've seen from him, a guy that's developed over time, he's probably going to end up going on and pursuing an NFL career. Same thing with Marcus McKeithen. I think that's more the thing, is that Carolina definitely needs some talent down there. And I mean, this spring was big for them. They did find some guys that can help them that are probably going to be, the future at that position. But when you look at an area that Carolina needs to sort of, address the talent level to be able to compete with some of those bigger name teams that are going to be on the schedule, even this year, against Notre Dame again, it's that offensive line spot. So I definitely think that Rice has to be pretty far up there. I think the fact that it's unofficial is one of the reasons why people will sort of, push that one to the back burner just a little bit. I think you're spot on with the corners. I think both of those guys are huge targets. They've both been pointed out multiple times by the coaching staff, that not by name, but you can tell that they are, pretty high valued, prospects. And pretty much every time that you get updates on this recruiting class, those are, two guys that everybody is looking for. And to see both of them get on campus, they'll be, on campus within 3 weeks of each other, is huge. I think, when you look at the two, with Everett, he's got a little bit more of a broader list, I think, right now. I feel like Carolina is definitely, a team that's got a legitimate shot here. But I think the thing is that, there are a couple of different teams that Carolina's got to be aware of. Where when it comes to Jaden Lucas, it feels like this is pretty much Clemson, and who is that team that's going to come from behind? Is it Carolina? Is there another team like Georgia that emerges and makes that push? It feels like he's pretty much got his favorite, and can somebody claw back from behind? Where with Everett, it's a little bit different. So that's a long way of saying that it's going to be two different recruiting pitches that the staff is going to have when these guys are on campus for their official visits. It'll be interesting to see, and we're going to talk a little bit more about those two. The battle that the staff is going to have for both Lucas and Everett, and which guy you'd want, more coming up here in just a second. But I think, both of those guys are pretty huge. Out of the two of them, because I thought I would pick one of them and go, somewhere else with it, I would say, the bigger of the two is Everett, just because of they're not really being a clear leader for him. I feel like that sort of allows Carolina to, if they have a really great visit, maybe establish themselves as the leader, which, for a while, this dude playing at IMG Academy down in Florida, that's a spot where Carolina has, believe it or not, they have never landed a recruit out of there, which shocked me because they've been in the running for a few guys from that have eventually gone down there. But usually when they get down there, they're not able to hold on to their recruitment, or if they're in the thick of it, there's a different team that enters, and all of a sudden Carolina sort of, gets pushed back a little bit, and somebody else eventually takes over and lands that commitment. With Everett, it's kind of been the opposite. He was, a guy that was offered when he was in Virginia, but Carolina has made some really good progress since he has been down at IMG Academy. That's one that Dre Bly has really made a push for. So I think that he's probably the bigger of the two corners when it comes to the most important. I have Jake Pope on there as well, an extremely important one, just because Jay Bateman has talked so much about how he really likes his fit in this defense. I think that you can't really go wrong with him or the guy that Carolina re-entered the race for, Sherrod Koval out of Virginia. Either one of those guys I think would be good fits, but it feels like from hearing what people have said that Jay Bateman really, really likes Jake Pope's fit in his defense. So I think getting him on campus, doing it early as well, that'll be the first official visit that Jake Pope takes, is definitely huge for Carolina as they try to establish their spot in the pecking order when it comes to yet another packed recruitment for Jake Pope. And, the other one I put on there was Caden Helms, the tight end out of Nebraska. Carolina is going to get one of the last swings at him when it comes to the month of June and the official visits in this month. And, I think the other thing, this is another position where it seems like there is a need here because you're going to lose Garrett Walston. You didn't land a tight end in this past past class. So, now you've sort of got to, I'm not going to say it's a must-have because you're still in pretty good shape. Kamari Morales, showed some things this spring that a lot of people liked. You still got John Copenhaver, who had his moments and flashes in the spring, according to people that were out there. And Kendall Carr is still on the roster, but you still want to have the depth here, and you can't really afford to go 2 years without landing a tight end because then you're sort of put into a position where you're going to have to go into the transfer portal to land some guys in future years. So I feel like this one's a pretty big one for Carolina because if you take a look at the rest of the tight ends in this class, it kind of feels a little bit like this 2021 recruiting class that we just wrapped up, where there was a guy or two that Carolina was in the running for, but they could never really get their footing. And now that I think about it, they did land Bryson Nesbitt. I don't know how that slipped my mind there, but you do have Bryson Nesbitt coming in, but I still feel like it's a position where you want to be able to land at least one or two guys. And I think the biggest thing with Nesbitt is you're still not exactly sure what he's going to be as a tight end because he is so raw. He was a guy that played basketball for most of his high school career and then really made the shift to playing football prior to his junior year. So you don't know if he's going to turn into a guy that's going to try to keep the weight off, be a receiving tight end for you, which is still something Carolina has been looking for, or if he's going to be able to put on that weight and become the blocking tight end that you want to see. I mean, he looked a lot better as a blocker this year than a year ago, but you're still not sure that that's exactly what he's going to be. So, those are the ones that I look at. A lot of really great visits coming up, and we'll make sure to put out that list for you guys as we get a little bit closer to the start of June, just in case you guys are unaware of the visits that are scheduled to take place. There are a ton of them, and Carolina in really good position to compete for a lot of these guys that will be coming on campus throughout the month of June. So we move on to some recruiting questions. We've done the true false. I think this one will be a little bit more open-ended. It won't be true or false in terms of statements. So it's going to be more of questions, a little bit more open-ended, as I mentioned, to be able to sort of gauge where Carolina is at in the 2022 cycle. All these questions are in the 2022 class. We're not really extending any further out because I think it's really tough to go any further at this point. I think maybe in the 2023 class, you're looking at maybe a guy like Caleb Downs, of course, the brother of Josh Downs, the nephew of Dre Bly. But other than that, I feel like the focus right now is on the 22 class, and a lot of guys are still taking their time here with the official visits opening back up, but still a chance for Carolina to do some damage over the next couple of months. And the first question I'll ask you, Zach, is with the Tar Heels missing out on Braden Locke, the quarterback prospect out of the state of Texas who we just talked about, is it safe to say that the Tar Heels will not be landing a quarterback in the 2022 cycle?
I don't agree with that necessarily. I don't think that it's safe to say that there's not going to be a quarterback just because there's still so much time in this recruiting class. We're barely here into the summer before senior season. So, you're going to have guys that are going to play this fall and might have, an explosive season, might get recognized. And you also have camp season over the summer, likely in June, where they're going to have guys on campus and they're going to try them out and, see sort of what's going on there in terms of what their aptitude is to earn a scholarship offer at the Power 5 level. In terms of sort of the type of quarterback that they want to take in 2022, it's likely more of a developmental guy, not necessarily a prospect that they, expect to come in and compete day one for starting minutes, a guy that they can put in the program and develop and can learn the offense. That's sort of what you've seen is that they've gotten really the big blue chip guy, and then they've gotten other guys to supplement that to make sure there is a continual process of both talent and experience in the room. And I think you look at I know what you mentioned, not to look too far ahead into 2023, but did want to mention quarterback that they already have on the radar here in state for 2023 in Tad Hudson out of Huff High School in Cornelius. So, they have options. They just got Drake May. They've got a guy that they're really kind of honing in on for 2023, and there's plenty of time for them to continue to recruit quarterbacks. So I don't think that it's safe to say that they won't have a quarterback in 2022. Even if they don't, I don't think it's going to be a huge deal.
I think that's the biggest thing. Now, I do think there is an element to this that will determine whether or not this becomes a big deal, and that's if they do keep all four quarterbacks in that room, because that was one of the main things that Mack Brown pointed out when it came to, this spring and that quarterback spot. A lot of people were asking about Jacoby Criswell, Drake May, that battle that they had a backup quarterback, but he made sure to mention that you still have Jefferson Boaz back there as well, and that they do want to keep all 4 guys going forward. Now, of course, I do think that Carolina would like to add a quarterback here, because I think and Mac Brown has said it multiple times, and I think just about everybody that's on campus, all the fans, pretty much everybody believes that, barring something stunning, Sam Howell will be gone after this season is over. So that leaves you with 3 if you can keep all the guys. I think that's, still a pretty good room. I think that might still allow you to hold on for another year and say, okay, we can just wait until the 23 cycle, maybe get one of those big names from in-state, maybe even go out-of-state and land a guy as well. There's a couple guys that Carolina has already gotten, offers out there too. One of them being Arch Manning, who will more than likely be one of the top players in the country. Right now he's the number 3 player in that cycle, and not saying that Carolina has an opportunity to land him. It's still early for him, and he's a guy that is going to be one of the most sought after quarterback prospects in a very long time, being the son of Cooper Manning, of course, from the Manning family. So, but yeah, no, I think that's going to be one of the big factors. Do one of the trio of Criswell, May, or Boaz look elsewhere? If they do, I think then that sort of puts a little bit more pressure on them to land a quarterback. But I'm with you. I think it's maybe too early to say that they are out on a quarterback in this class. But I would say if I had to right now, if you asked me right now if I thought they would land a quarterback in this class, I would say no. And look, it's not for a lack of trying. They had 2 guys that they really felt were good fits in their offense if they could get them in Cade Klubnik and Braden Locke. And look, didn't work out with either one of them. Carolina made a push, more so with Locke. Klubnik, I think, look, if Clemson doesn't enter the race, maybe Carolina has a fighting chance. But pretty much everybody knew when Clemson entered the race that race was over. So, Carolina, they tried their hand. There weren't a ton of guys in this class, especially in-state. This was a pretty light class in 2021. And I think, the other part of that is the fact that Carolina wasn't able to have as many guys on campus as they were in the past. Sometimes you'll bring some of these in-state guys on campus. You'll find out that you really like a guy even though he really isn't that highly rated. You didn't really have that aspect this year. So I think, like you said, I think there will be some guys that they're keeping an eye on. There's a couple of prospects in-state. One guy that I think is a name to keep an eye on as we go forward here, as they go into the fall, that could emerge is a guy that plays here in the Charlotte area close to me, Lucas Lenoff out of Myers Park High School. That's the same place, of course, that Drake May came from. He came over from the state of California and had a pretty successful junior season here in the spring. Now he's going to come back, is expected to play his senior year here as well. So he could be one of those guys to keep an eye on if you're looking for an in-state prospect that could emerge. But I still think that there is a chance they could land one. I just don't, as of right now, I would not bank on it at this point. So we'll move on to the next question. The Tar Heels appear to be in a good standing with the trio of George Pettaway. You've got Amarian Hampton and Michael Allen, all guys that are either in the Tidewater area or in state, right in that recruiting footprint. And then, as you mentioned, there's Georgia is considered just outside of the recruiting footprint, but you got Damari Alston down there at a Woodward Academy right outside of Atlanta that Carolina is in good standing with as well. Of the 4, which duo would you want the Tar Heels to land the most in this 22 cycle?
In terms of that question, in terms of my internal ranking from watching the film on each of these guys, I have them ranked pretty much exactly how the 24/7 composite ranking has them I have George Petway at the top, Marion Hampton after him, Michael Allen in third, and Amari Alston in fourth. So just by process of elimination, Amari Alston, which I also think is the running back with the least amount of interest of those four in North Carolina, I probably wouldn't include him in my duo that I have to pick. So really, any of those top three, whether it be George Petway, Amari Hampton, or Michael Allen, I would love to have any of those three guys really in the combination. I would, of course, like to have, George Petway and Marion Hampton if I could. If it is Petway and Allen, that's fine. If it's Hampton and Allen, that's fine. Preferably Petway and Hampton if I had to pick two.
Yeah. So with Alston, I think you're right. His interest level is. It's hard to tell. I mean, he was a guy that I'm not sure if he ended up coming up for the spring game, but he was looking to come up and attend the spring game. So clearly he still has interest in Carolina. You're not going to come up, watch a game, a spring practice, basically, that was supposed to be and was a rainy day in Chapel Hill if you don't have some interest in the university. So I definitely think that he's still a guy to keep an eye on, but I think you're right. And when you look at him, I've seen all four of the guys play a little bit. The one I know the least about is Allen. But that's mainly because he was banged up for most of this junior year. He had an injury early in the season for J.H. Rose High School. Of course, Amari and Hampton, of course, went down middle of the year for Cleveland High School, but it appears like he's going to be okay. There's nothing to worry about there, so that shouldn't hurt, really anybody's perception of what he could be going forward. But yeah, I would say I think that to me, Hampton and Petaway are the two guys at the top that I think are head and shoulders above the other guys. I think Allen and Alston are kind of interchangeable. I think they're both kind of in that same area in terms of talent. I think both guys, one's a little bit different than the other in terms of style, but I do think that talent level wise, they are right in that same area. I'm with you. I think Petway and Hampton are probably the duo that you would want the most. But at the same time, I think really you could take Petway and then Hampton or Allen. I think would be your preference because Petway's a guy that can kind of do multiple things for you. He's a little bit more of the slippery back. He's the guy that's more of a finesse runner. He's going to make things happen with the ball in his hand, whether it's handoff or catching the ball out of the backfield. So that's why I think he's one of the guys that you've got to have. If you're looking at a duo, he's got to be one of the two guys in there because then when you get to Hampton and Allen, both of them are hard runners. They're both guys that are going to, prefer probably to run inside the tackles. That's going to be where they're going to make the bulk of their money when it comes to them eventually having careers down the line at the NFL level. And, I think Hampton's probably the more attractive because there's a lot of people that look at his game and compare him to Javonte Williams. He's also got a little bit better speed than Allen. He's a guy that can really fly. But I think, both of those guys, I think, are very intriguing prospects with their fit when it goes along with Petway. But Petaway, excuse me. But if you had to pick one of the two, it would be Hampton. But I'm with you. I think any combination of those three primarily, because you would still take the Hampton-Allen combination as well. I think any of those three would be great, but I would want Hampton and Petaway the most out of the group. In terms of where Carolina stands with them, it feels like Carolina's in a really good spot with him, especially since the injury. I think there are a couple of teams that were pushing hard for him that may have backed off just a little bit, but it still seems like there are going to be some big time suitors for him. Carolina has established themselves firmly in that race, though. Allen, he was a guy that it felt like NC State sort of got a little bit of an advantage. There were a couple of crystal balls that were cast for him to go to NC State, but Carolina has sort of fought their way back in that one. They've kept them, at distance, but they've made, a little bit of a push to, potentially land themselves an official visit here at some point. I believe that Carolina is going to get an unofficial visit from him during the month of June. I believe they have said that he will take one official visit during the month of June and then a couple of unofficial visits. I believe the official is going to be to East Carolina, but I could be wrong on that, so take that with a grain of salt. And then, with Petaway, I think, Carolina received some crystal balls for him. I still think Carolina is pretty much in the driver's seat on that one. There are some other teams that are trying to make pushes there, but it still feels like Carolina is in a really good spot. So all three of these guys, I think Carolina's definitely got an opportunity to land. We talked about it a little bit earlier. We move on to the corners. The Tar Heels are in the race for both Dalen Everett and Jaden Lucas. When it comes to those two, which guy do you think that the Tar Heels have the best chance of landing right now?
I think that is, it can be difficult to say, and I think you have to look at sort of where their recruitments are. And you'll see a lot of similar teams actually in both of these recruitments. Both have North Carolina and Clemson featured prominently in their recruitments. But in my opinion, I think that Jaden Lucas is essentially down to North Carolina and Clemson. I think that he had Ohio State in there a little bit, but I really think that he's mainly down to those two. And as you mentioned, does have an official visit to North Carolina set for the weekend of June the 4th through the 6th, and then will be at Clemson the weekend after that. In terms of his recruitment, he is not a Clemson fan. He has clarified that publicly, that his family are not Clemson fans. He's not a Clemson fan necessarily, but does live in that area and does have a lot of that influence and has been to campus a ton of times. Now, Dre Bly has obviously done work there in terms of building those relationships, of recruiting him, and of having, a puncher's chance in this recruitment. But I feel that Clemson has built a good lead. Flipping over to Dalen Everett, he's a little bit more open, as you mentioned, has a little bit more of, more potential suitors, not only having North Carolina and Clemson as mentioned, but has, I believe, UGA, Florida State, and Oregon rounding out his top five. Now, I don't really know how much I consider Florida State or Oregon to be threats there, but UGA I would definitely consider to be a threat. And they're another team that Everett will likely take an official visit to alongside North Carolina. But despite that race being a little bit more open, having a little bit more of those prime contenders, I actually feel that North Carolina might have a better chance in that recruitment as of this point. As I mentioned with Lucas, I feel like Clemson built a pretty good lead where Everett feels a little bit more open. It feels like the Tar Heels really have a better position at this time with that, Tidewater connection to Dre Bly as the quarterback's coach. I think that they've got, a really good chance, or maybe, so to say, a little bit of a better chance for Everett than they do for Lucas. And I would actually go ahead and, go out there and predict that they might be in the driver's seat for Everett at this time, as surprising as that might be for some to hear.
I'm right there with you. I think that that's kind of where you're starting to go with Everett, with everything that we've started to hear coming out about him. Clemson is there, but you're right. They're not as prominently there with him as they were with Lucas, where, with Lucas, I mean, a couple months ago, we pretty much thought he was Clemson, that's a wrap. But he didn't make the commitment. I think a lot of people were sort of wondering why. Most people, I think, just came to the conclusion that he wanted to take some of these official visits like a lot of guys do. And now there looks like, okay, maybe there is, a little bit of a crack in the door where somebody can creep in. But with Everett, yeah, it's more wide open, and I feel like, Dre Bly has made a great push there and has an opportunity to, potentially, as you said, be in the driver's seat. I think if they're not in the driver's seat yet, and again, if they are in the driver's seat, I mean, they just got in. Let's be honest. I mean, they have barely started the car up. But if they're not in there yet, they've got a chance with this official visit. With Everett, you mentioned, how big of a competitor is Florida. I would say Florida State is probably the bigger competitor of the two between them and Oregon, just because they're an in-state team in terms of, him going to IMG Academy. I also feel like that would be one of those big-time gets for Florida State that would sort of calm the masses for, a fan base that is still in turmoil. Even under Mike Norvell, they thought, maybe another coaching change would help them there. It hasn't. Everything right now is still in flux there, so that would be huge. They're still recruiting at a pretty solid level, but that would really make a statement there. So you would imagine that they are going to be pushing hard to try to get Dalen Everett to Tallahassee. When it comes to Georgia, I think, when you look at their recruiting prowess, especially when it comes to defensive backs, I mean, they've been phenomenal there for the last couple of years. They just put another group of extremely talented guys in the NFL out of that defensive backfield. There's definitely a draw there for recruits whenever they are being recruited by Georgia. But there is one thing to remember here. They already have a cornerback commit in this class, a 4-star in Marquise Groves Killebrew. So I don't know how much that plays into it. You can take multiple corners in a class and it's not going to be a problem. But I still think that could play a factor here. And you may be saying, well, could Carolina end up with both? I mean, it's possible, but I'm going to tell you, I don't really know if it's not really from a Tar Heel perspective where they would turn guys away. Remember, they already have Tayon Holloway in this class, so they're not gonna more than likely push Holloway out. I don't see that happening in order to get both of these guys in there. And at the same time, I don't think that if, let's say one of the two commits, the other guy that is uncommitted is going to say, well, I'll be the third to join that class and just go there and compete. I mean, look, there are some guys that, definitely are willing to compete. I don't think either one of these guys are not willing to do that. I think that the main thing is that you do want to go to a place where, there is still some opportunity to potentially play early. So you never really know. But I definitely think you're right. I think Everett is the guy that you look at. I do think, there is an aspect to Lucas. There's a guy that is going to visit campus. Carolina just recently offered him Deuce Caldwell, who's listed as an inside linebacker, can also he's kind of like one of those hybrid guys. Basically, he's either going to be an inside linebacker or a hybrid safety. He's going to be one of those two, and he's going to play in the box if he's a safety as well. He comes out of Malden High School as well, just recently offered. He'll be taking an official visit in the month of June. If he was to commit to Carolina, and he seems pretty receptive to Carolina at this point, that could be a factor that could change things a little bit for Lucas when it comes to Carolina, and maybe put Carolina even more in the thick of things. But until then, I think Everett is the guy that you got to go with out of the two. So we move on. Zack Rice scheduled 4 official visits in the month of June. Of course, as we mentioned, he is going to visit Carolina on June 1st, but that is not an official visit. So he is the only one of his top 5 that will not be receiving an official visit are the Tar Heels. His mother did post on Twitter, though, after they finished up setting those official visits, that they will be officially visiting Carolina at some point, though. Are you concerned at all about the fact that he is not taking one of his 4 official visits in the month of June to Chapel Hill?
I would say there is at least a slight concern, just that those were moved around and that was the one that was dropped. I mean, in terms of where most people consider his interest to be, it would probably have Carolina, pretty firmly at the top of that list or close to the top of that list in terms of his interest. So it's at least a slight concern, especially since the majority of the time with recruitments that Carolina is involved with, they're not going to land a guy if they don't receive an official visit or, steady visits from him when he's going to other locations. So it is a slight concern just because of that. Now, I do want to preface, as you mentioned, Zach's mom did mention that they would, take the official visit another time. There are options outside of the weekends. I mean, it'll be one of the summer months. If they can work out, the work schedule, you can go on official visits in the middle of the week for a few days. There's no issue with that. So I think that would be, a fairly likely, thing that could happen if they get that schedule worked out right, that they could, have an official visit one weekend, have sort of a midweek official visit at North Carolina, and then, go right into the next set of visits, whatever that next weekend's visit is. But I think that this is a recruitment that Carolina needs to continue to watch. I don't think that this is a recruitment that is finished up by any means. I think, really any of the top 5 schools that he has here has somewhat of a legitimate chance. If I had to pick a top 3, I think there is a distinct top 3 of North Carolina, Virginia, and Alabama at this time. I don't think that Notre Dame or Ohio State are quite as high as those 3. So those would be ones to watch. Virginia, obviously, as a team that he has family connections to and lives close to. Alabama as the defending national champion, and then North Carolina, school that he's visited a ton. I mean, it seemed like every time that there is an event, either a game this past fall or, any interest in the spring game, we know that he was looking to go to that. There's been significant interest there. So it is a slight concern, but with the significant likelihood he can take that official visit in June, albeit not on the weekends, and really just the interest that we've seen up until this point.
Yeah,
I would pump the brakes on any concern there.
Yeah, see, I'm not really concerned at all because of what you just mentioned right there. He has been a frequent visitor on campus. Even this past year, as you mentioned, this past year, he was pretty much one of the only guys that was on campus at any point during the COVID year. So he's been there a ton. Of course, he has a good relationship with Tony Grimes' dad. So yeah, I think what you're probably looking at for him is he's probably going to visit in season. That'll be when his official visit will take place, which is, a really good chance for Carolina, because they will be that final official visit, to really make a strong statement. And that's the thing. Like, I think people are kind of worried that he's going to take those 4 official visits and then he's just going to make his decision there. I don't think that's necessarily the case, because as you mentioned, I do think you're starting to see some of those teams separate, which, I mean, that's interesting that you say that, Alabama, Virginia are the 2 teams that are the threat, because remember, earlier, or back in, what was it? It was in late December, early January, there was a lot of buzz around the fact that him and Gunnar Givens, the 5-star offensive tackle prospect from the mountain areas of Virginia, they were going to potentially team up and go to Ohio State. That prospect has pretty much been backed off, and now, pretty much what you said. There are a lot of people that have kind of pushed Ohio State almost out of the running for him at this point. They're still in his top 5, but at this point, most people think that they're probably further down on that top 5 than some of the other top competitors. So. I'm not really all that concerned about. If he was a guy that hadn't been to Carolina at any point before, or had only been there once or twice, I might be saying to myself, okay, this is a little concerning, especially with the fact that people thought this was one of the top contenders. But he's been there so often, he's got so many connections to the campus, that it just feels like he's going to want to look at these other schools, kind of compare them to what he's seen from Carolina before, and then potentially take that one last visit to Carolina and see, look, is this the place that I want to be? How exactly does this stack up to the other official visits? What's different about this official visit than some of the unofficials that I've taken here? Everything like that. And I think eventually he'll compare that. I mean, look, as of right now, from what's been rumored, he is taking a June 1st unofficial too. So even though he's not taking an official visit to Carolina during the month of June, he feels like it is is necessary to still go back to campus, a place where he's been multiple times, and take another visit there. So I think that should show you right there that you shouldn't be overly concerned about this. Last question that we'll get to here before we move on and wrap this up. The Tar Heels' last commitment in the 22 cycle was back when Malachi Hamrick committed on February 26th. Do you think that the Tar Heels will land a new commitment to the class in the month of June?
I would say that they should get at least one commitment in the month of June. Mm-hmm. Just in terms of the general schedule that we're looking at, of course, as we've mentioned, recruiting will open up in June. Across the country, you're going to have kids on campus, not necessarily every day, but pretty much every weekend, and then multiple days throughout the week. And then all over June, they'll be having camps on campuses around the country and everything along those lines. And I think another piece to look at in this puzzle is that Carolina, Mac Brown, and the Carolina staff really prefer to save those official visits until the fall if they can. They want kids to have that true Tar Heel game day experience. They want to be able to give them the quality time of a fall weekend and really give them that experience as opposed to coming on campus in the summer when everything is empty. So with that said, we're seeing guys coming in and officially visiting here in June, which doesn't really match up with that. So, sort of what you can interpret from that, if you want to, or extrapolate, is that these guys that we're seeing come on campus, these are guys that are, looking to take their visits and likely commit either at the end of June or moving into July and August. And I think when, you compare these guys that we mentioned on the unofficial list, you look at, the number of the in-state guys that they have, it's very likely that Carolina has at least one commitment in the month of June. I would say probably even more likely that they have one or more commitments throughout the months of July and August as these kids sort of finish up their visits and move into time when they can make their decisions. But I'd say at least one in June.
I would agree with you. I think where it's going to come from is going to be interesting. Is it going to be from one of these official visits? As you mentioned, the camps are always interesting as well, because that's one of those areas where there might be somebody that maybe wasn't on your radar. You end up offering them there. They accept on the spot. That's happened before. There's also some guys that are going to come out there that, may have been on the fence about making a decision, end up pulling the trigger on a decision there. So I think there are going to be, some interesting names that are going to get some buzz. But I do think, I think one of the guys that takes an official visit will commit. Now, I'll say this. I'm not going to throw a name out there. I'm going to write an article here over the next week or so where we'll go through and try to predict that next guy that Carolina could potentially land. I've done it before. It's a really fun article, so I'm going to do that one again. But here's the thing. I don't know if it's going to be – I don't think it's going to be one of the big names. I don't think it's going to be Everett. I don't think it's going to be Lucas. I think those guys are going to wait. They're going to wait. As you mentioned, it may come down in June or August, but I think they are going to wait a little bit and kind of let all of these official visits play out, and then they'll figure out what exactly they want to do in terms of where they want to go. But I do think that it could be one of those high-end 3 stars, maybe, even one of the 4 stars that ends up popping for Carolina. So I agree with you. I think one of the guys that comes on campus, I think Carolina will land someone, but I think the months that you're going to be keeping an eye on are July and August. And I think I've seen it a couple of times. There are some people that are concerned about the fact that Carolina hasn't landed anybody on the recruiting trail since Malachi Hamrick. There's no reason to be concerned. The minute that they said that they were that they were lifting the recruiting dead period, pretty much anybody that was thinking about potentially making a commitment outside of a handful of guys pretty much put everything on hold and said, look, let's just wait until we can get on campus and make these decisions. That's all over the country. We have not seen a ton of guys committing. There have been a few here and there, but for the most part, especially the big name guys at the top of a lot of these teams' recruiting boards, they have stayed put. They're looking to get on campus, and then they'll, go from there, evaluate things, and make their decisions. So there's no reason to be concerned about that at all. But yeah, I do think Carolina lands one in June, and then you'll extend it into the summer, and you could see a couple of guys adding their name to that class once you get into July and August. So that finishes it up for this edition of the podcast. We'll shut it down with some news and notes from around Tar Heel football. Of course, one of the main news and newsworthy things that you saw over the last couple of days was that the Tar Heels did schedule a home-and-home series with the South Carolina Gamecocks. So, of course, Carolina has the second game of the, I guess now it's called the Duke's Mayo Kickoff Classic. They changed sponsors. It used to be the Belk Kickoff Classic from a couple of years ago against South Carolina. That'll be in Charlotte. That's coming up here. I believe that's next year in Charlotte to kick off the season. So Carolina hasn't hosted South Carolina. It'll be when they cycle around to hosting South Carolina in 2029. It will be 22 years since the last time that they met each other in Kenan Stadium. So that's going to be really interesting, welcoming them in again. That'll be the second game of that home-and-home series for 2028 and 2029. The prior year, Carolina will go to Williams-Brice Stadium to play the Gamecocks. Of course, we remember back in 2014, Carolina opened their season there against the Gamecocks. So it'll be interesting. We'll see what Carolina is able to do in terms of, that matchup is one that's sort of becoming a rivalry. I don't know if it would be classified up there with some of the others that you see in the ACC, but this, I think, continues to show that Carolina is doing everything possible to try to make that into, maybe not a bitter rivalry, but one that, Carolina has some history in. They'll play each other rather often, and definitely something that's worth keeping an eye on over the next couple of years. See if they try to get each other on the schedule even in between there. 5 Tar Heels did take part in rookie mini camps this past weekend. Rookie mini camps throughout the NFL. A bunch of guys for Carolina were in attendance, and of course the focus, on guys like Michael Carter, Javonte Williams, De'Ami Brown, and some good things coming out about them. But I think the guy that really surprised a lot of people was Daz Newsome out at Bears camp. He was a guy that was taken in the 6th round. We didn't really know how much of a role he would have out there, and he reportedly really impressed a lot of the coaches out there. So that's great news for Daz Newsome. He'll have a chance to push and attempt to make that Chicago Bears roster for the 2021 season that is coming up in the fall. The Tar Heels did receive 2020 season rings. We're going to talk about this a little bit more on the next edition of the podcast that I do with Josh Marlowe. He really wants to talk through this. They received them, of course, state championship rings because they went undefeated in the state of North Carolina this past year and did go to the Orange Bowl. Those were handed out the other day from Mack Brown and his staff to the players. And 13 Tar Heels land on Athlon Sports preseason All-ACC teams. Those were announced yesterday. First team, Sam Howell, Joshua Izudu. Second team, you've got Tony Grimes and Raymond Vohasek. Third team, Ty Chandler, Trey Morrison, and Jordan Tucker. And the fourth team, you got Brian Anderson, Josh Downs, Storm Duck, Tamari Fox, Tamon Fox, and Ben Kiernan. Definitely think Josh Downs will be a guy that has a chance to climb up onto some of those, those first and second team All-ACC teams whenever we're talking about them in the postseason from the conference. But we'll keep an eye on all that stuff going forward. Some other news that'll be coming out over the next couple of months throughout Tar Heel football as we get into the offseason, all on the website, HeelToughBlog.com. That's the place where you can check out all the articles that we've got up there right now. Things have definitely slowed down a little bit, but we've got the update on, the recruiting trail for you guys. We did that sort of recapping the last, month and a half or so of Tar Heel football recruiting. Of course, we've got, some of the recent offers that are on there. We tell you about the guys that are going to visit campus during the month of June and tell you, pretty much everything that you need to know about the recruiting trail and where Carolina stands at this point in the 2022, 23, 24, and even 25 cycle with some of their recent offers and some of the visits that will be coming up for the Tar Heels. Of course, as I mentioned, there is going to be an article going up where we're going to predict who will be the next member of the 2022 class. I'll be doing that one, so make sure that you guys are keeping an eye out for that on the website. And there'll be a couple other really fun articles that we'll be putting up over the next couple of weeks, a lot of them involving the recruiting trail. And, of course, you don't want to miss any of the scouting report articles that we're going to continue to do throughout the summer, which are going to take looks at some of those guys that we just talked about. Caden Helms, the tight end from Nebraska. We are going to be taking a look at him before he gets on campus for his official visit, so that one will be going up there soon. Also, we got one going up about Jaden Lucas going up there soon, so that'll be an interesting one for you guys to check out, and plenty of other guys that will be going over the next couple of weeks, so make sure that you guys keep it tuned to HeelToughBlog.com. That's also a place where you can check out the podcast. The Heel Tough Blog podcast has its own tab. The Four Corners podcast has its own tab. Of course, that's the rebranded version of the Roy's Voice podcast with Roy Williams retiring. So that's up there on the website. You guys can check all of that out and make sure that while you're there, you rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. You can do that on any of your podcast platforms as well. That rating and reviewing helps us move up some of the rankings, and the subscribe feature is for you so that you won't miss an episode of the podcast. We are expecting, once again, to have some former players on this summer, so you do not want to miss any of that, along with all these other great recruiting and off-season editions of the podcast as well. Last thing we did want to tell you is make sure to check out the Facebook and Twitter pages. Facebook, best place for everything. You can like and follow the Facebook page. That will allow you to see all of the editions of the podcast in there, including the video versions that we put up there for you guys as well, the waveform versions right now, but eventually we will get back into the video versions once we get closer to the season with our studio that we have gotten back. That's a big thing for us. And then also all those articles that we mentioned, those will be right there as well. Or if you want to follow us on Twitter, you can follow the Twitter page at Heel Tough Blog on Twitter. So that wraps it up for this edition of the podcast. Want to thank Zack for hosting with me. Want to thank you guys for listening. And as always, go Tar Heels.